Welcome to Strange Days, Here We Come. I'm your host, the pop mythologist. And as you may have guessed from that unmistakable sound, yes, we will be discussing Godzilla today. Specifically two films, 2016's Shin Godzilla, which was recently re-released in theaters this past August in a remastered 4K version, and 2023's Godzilla Minus One. Joining me once again is film critic and novelist Jess Kroll, who a number of years ago wrote an article on pop mythology, in fact, about Godzilla, connecting it to Pacific Rim as well. I'll include the link for that in the show notes for anyone interested. So yeah, Jess, are you excited to talk about the king of monsters who's actually not really a monster, but a symbol? I guess you could say that about all monsters to some degree.
Yeah, I think originally that was the case, but it seems more and more nowadays that monsters are just monsters. You know, where a lot of modern, well, I guess the last few years it's been different, but there was a time where we had like sort of peak zombie and they were no longer symbols of capitalism or things like that. It was just zombies for the sake of zombies.
Yeah, which is in itself zombie-like.
Yes, the genre itself became a shambling husk of what it used to be.
Oh, I love it. Okay, great. So, very good. Before we get to the topic at hand, though, if you'll just bear with me, I just want to briefly acknowledge something to the audience. So at this point, I feel like I should call this podcast Strange Days, Here We Are, instead of Here We Come, because it is just absolutely wild out there right now. And we're not going to go too deep into it in this episode just because we have a designated topic, which is also kind of relevant. But I do plan on addressing it much more explicitly in future episodes, obviously through the lens of art and pop culture, because that's what this podcast is. But there are a number of reasons why I haven't been doing more of that already. And one is just the fact that I'm really busy for various reasons, don't have much time for podcasting. Another is I want to be sure to choose specific works of art that do justice to things that are going on and can shed some interesting light. And then lastly, as someone who's always thinking about and looking at the research in psychology and sociology for what ways of communicating are actually effective and lead to kinds of outcomes we want versus ways that are not effective or just make things worse. And the way I see it now, American society is very ill. It is very unwell. Some of what's going on is a global problem, but some of it is uniquely American, but also in ways that have global repercussions. So in a way, it's everyone's concern. But when an illness reaches late stages, I think you can't keep using the same kinds of treatment. Like maybe those treatments were never effective to begin with, or they were effective at one time, but the late stage of the illness requires different approaches. And so I just want to be sure to talk about these issues in ways that are actually constructive and helpful, from my viewpoint anyway, and that actually achieve the objectives that I want. And what I want partly is to not add to the problems, first of all. And unfortunately, I see a lot of that happening now, both in the general and social media. So it's important to me to approach it in a certain kind of way. And so that's all I'll say about it for now. And there will be more to come. And like, Jess, not to put you on the spot or anything, but if there's anything you'd like to add to that, please feel free to do so.
I think you stated it quite well. I feel as though anything that I say might launch us into a completely different direction.
Yeah. I guess that would also be kind of interesting.
I've probably been contributing in my own way to the polarization on social media because I use it as just a way of screaming into the void.
And I totally get that. Although the two of us on this show so far, I think when we have addressed socio-political themes, I think we've gone about in a pretty good way that doesn't really add to the problem.
Hopefully. It's funny because I'm so afraid of saying something that's incorrect on these podcasts. And then I look on the news and you just see people giving the most blatantly false information you can possibly imagine. Whereas like I say one wrong thing and it eats at me for weeks.
Here we go. We're already sort of going off on a...
Yeah, see, this is why I shouldn't have said anything.
To be continued, though.
Yes, please.
Okay, back to Godzilla. So I should say there are a couple of reasons I wanted to discuss these films today. One is the re-release, as mentioned, of Shin Godzilla, bringing that film back onto people's radar. But also just the fact that we've entered the Halloween season, and I've been wanting to do some episodes on horror, but of course from a dystopian or collapse-informed perspective, or both. And even though for the most part, I personally don't consider Godzilla horror. I think a lot of people would probably agree that Shin Godzilla, at least, is close to horror or maybe even just all-out horror. What would you say?
Yeah, I would think both of these sort of have horror elements. Like, -1 had some pretty, like, terrifying sequences as well.
Absolutely. Actually, come to think of it, yeah, no, totally. That little boat, I mean, we'll get to it, but that boat sequence when the little minesweeping crew first comes across Godzilla, that was pretty intense.
Yes.
And then, I don't know if you happen to see it, but there are some edited scenes cut out of Shin Godzilla that I think they should have left in because they were creepy, like much closer to horror. And like much has been made about the so-called Lovecraftian influences in this film. And as someone who has read Lovecraft, I personally feel like those were overstated. But some of the scenes that were cut out, those felt more Lovecraftian. But in any event, before I forget as well, there will be spoilers galore for both Shin Godzilla and -1. And I guess since we've already mentioned Shin Godzilla, maybe we can start with that one.
Sounds good.
Cool. So, Shin Godzilla, released in 2016, re-released in 2025. Written by Hideaki Anno of Neon Genesis Evangelion fame. And directed as well by Anno. And co-directed by Shinji Higuchi. And I read that Higuchi mostly did the technical monster sequences, and Anno, not surprisingly, directed most of the overall creative vision. And just to mention something before I forget as well, do you remember that one scene kind of early on in Shin Godzilla when some of the members of the disaster task force first realized Godzilla is radioactive and they're scrolling through social media? Do you remember that?
Yeah, I believe I remember that. There were so many different forces in this film, but I remember them scrolling through social media.
Yeah, in that sequence, or the one that I'm thinking of, they're scrolling through like some version of like Twitter or whatever, and the profile picture on one of the accounts is Asuka from Neon Genesis Evangelion.
I was looking around to see if they would have any Evangelion Easter eggs like that.
Easter eggs,
yeah.
That makes total sense. There might have been more, but that was one. And also, you mentioned like numerous task forces. Yeah, this film is dense. It has a cast as gargantuan as Godzilla himself. Like, I'm not even going to try to keep track of all the titles, department names, and everything. I guess I'll just mention a few key people. So there is the young, idealistic, sort of mid-level politician in the prime minister's cabinet, Rando Yaguchi, played by a very likable Hiroki Hasegawa. His mentor, a really interesting character, Hideki Akasaka, played by Yutaka Takenuchi. The PM, played by Ren Osugi, who's often collaborated with Takeshi Kitano, the guy who makes all those Yakuza movies. One interesting member of Rando's disaster response task force, Hiromi Ogashira, played by Mikako Ichikawa. And then another interesting character, although a bit maybe aesthetically problematic in some ways, Kayoko Ann Patterson, played by Satomi Ishihara. And just because she's supposed to be like Japanese American, but clearly is native Japanese because of her accent.
Also played apparently Haji in the live action adaptation of Attack on Titan. So she's a bit of a huge monster attacking civilization veteran.
Wait, which one? Which actress?
The actress who played the U.S. envoy. She played
Kayoko.
Hanji.
Okay, Patterson. Yeah.
Yeah, she played Hanji in the live action adaptation of Attack on Titan.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely had to, I guess, use my imagination a bit to ignore the very clear Japanese accent in her English. I felt kind of bad because I read that the actress found those scenes really difficult and stressful. Like they made her want to cry.
Well, I mean, Americans will cast people as, other nationalities and have terrible accents all the time.
100%. Yeah, that's a very good point, and it is important to remember that. I mean, even just like, there's so many examples of that. I remember Black Panther, there was like a Korean character, and I was like, oh my God, her accent is so bad.
I remember a lot of people complaining about Lost, a Korean couple there. The man was supposed to not be able to speak English, but apparently his Korean was really bad, while the Korean actress could speak complete English, and she was actually from Korea.
Oh, interesting. I haven't seen Lost, so I don't know. But no, it's obviously, it's a little thing that goes both ways, for sure. But it was interesting to me in the sense that this didn't strike me as like a low budget film, right? So I feel like, why couldn't they have just gotten like a Japanese American or Asian American actor? It seemed like it would have been not that hard. But again, the exact same thing could be said for like Black Panther, right? Where they clearly just didn't try that hard to find someone.
I would say not my main issue, but one of the things that I was most fascinated by with the Patterson character is just sort of the naivete that Americans would vote for an Asian woman as president.
Yeah, the whole thing where like she was aspiring to be a president by 40, and I'm like,
at 40, and you can't be president until you're 45. And also the idea that Americans would vote for someone who isn't a white man.
Exactly, that too. So all those things combined. But I think a good place to start our proper discussion would be this. So in all the genuinely great Godzilla films, Godzilla is always a symbol for something else. In the 1954 original, it was clearly the devastation of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan and just nuclear war in general. Now, this film has often been said to be a critique of the Japanese government's response or lack of response to the Fukushima disaster. And indeed, that critique is there, it's visible. But for me, and I'll ask you about your thoughts on this in a second, but as I was watching this, especially the first time, for me, Godzilla felt very much like the eco-climate crisis for numerous reasons, including the slowness of the government to respond initially, the denial and choosing to believe that things are fine even though they're not, or that XYZ worst case scenario won't happen, but then it does. And also in the way they try to use brute force to stop something that clearly can't be stopped by force. It can only be stopped or mitigated by science. But even then, the work must be approached with the utmost cooperation and urgency. So for all those reasons, and then there's also this one little moment that reminded me of Don't Look Up. For me in this film, Godzilla felt like the climate crisis. How about you?
That's literally one of the notes that I wrote. And also, I also had a moment where I was like, oh, this is like Don't Look Up. Yeah, the imagery of the Fukushima disaster was blatant. It was, very, very clear. But yeah, it felt more to me like it was a statement on humanity abusing resources and using technology that we don't understand. And then the ramifications that we haven't considered, consequences that we had no regard when we started it. There's the illegal dumping of the radioactive material into the ocean, and they say that's what made this version of Godzilla exist.
Right. As opposed to like the testing at Bikini Atoll in the original and also -1. This one shows like the dumping of the material that the pre-Godzilla life form fed on.
Yeah, I'd literally have a note that says, look at climate change, something we've unleashed on the world that is now endangering us in a way that our weapons can't.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Precisely what you said.
Yeah, no, it's, great minds speak alike. By the way, just a quick aside, because I did kind of want to throw this in, but don't really know when would be a good moment. If anyone out there is interested in metal music that's collapse-aware and heavy in ecological themes, there's actually a French death metal band called Gojira. In fact, originally they called themselves Godzilla, but they had to change it for copyright reasons, which I think was actually good because I think Gojira is a better name for a metal band than Godzilla. But I don't understand why the name Gojira is allowed if Godzilla isn't. But yeah, I digress. So back to what Godzilla represents. Notably in this film, they use the it pronoun to refer to Godzilla instead of like he, like in the Hollywood films, or she, or whatever. Almost as if to emphasize, speaking of what we were just saying a moment ago, that it's a force of nature, a disaster, and not like a creature. I mean, it is obviously in the fictional universe, but symbolically it's not like something to be thought of as like a he or a she. It's an it.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I noticed it more prominently in -1. But yeah, this one referring to it as it sort of distances Godzilla from. It's funny because it is seen as sort of a dehumanizing term when I don't think it's inherent to the pronoun it to be dehumanized, but we see it that way. And so it sort of functions in that sense, moving the creature from having any sort of conscious or even awareness, which was something that was interesting. If you don't mind, I'd like to springboard into another topic. The effects in this, for the beginning, there's the different forms of Godzilla in this film. And in the beginning, the eyes look so glazed over, like it's not aware of any of its surroundings at all. And I found that very interesting.
I did too. I was kind of two minds of it. On one hand, given that the effects in this film overall were very good, I thought, and it's obviously much more technically sophisticated than the 1954 one, obviously, and the minus one is even more so. But in a lot of ways, Godzilla, especially early on, where he's like crawling out of the sea, that horrific, scary-looking creature, also tragic in some ways, it seemed to me. But yeah, it in some ways felt very alive and animate, but its eyes just felt very static. And I was trying to think about, I wonder if that was like an intentional aesthetic choice to sort of emphasize the force of nature. Because there's one part where they're like trying to understand the mentality and they're like, it just walks. Like not really like thinking or in the way that we would think of it, of thinking. So I wasn't sure if it was doing that deliberately or what, but there were times when I'm like, man, this Godzilla doesn't feel, I mean, it's moving clearly and it's doing stuff, but like its face and its eyes just don't quite look fully there or alive. It's interesting.
Which could actually be, well, as I think we've both alluded, it's adding to the sort of the force of nature idea. It's not something that acts really consciously, at least in the beginning, because it does evolve over the course of the film. It feels like it's not fully aware of its surroundings and environments. It's just dragging itself onto the shore. And I will say, effects-wise, like it very nicely captures the sort of janky, awkward movements of the original Godzilla. And I read that it was all computer effects, but it looks like, a rubber costume, which makes it very interesting to see. And then there's the environmental effects around it, which are great. Seeing all the cars go flying and the boats stacking up in that little channel. That was a remarkable there.
Yeah.
So it was such an interesting design of this iconic character, this iconic monster, to change the color of it, change its appearance, at least in the very beginning, where it's just sort of like a beached whale pushing itself along.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really interesting and cool as well. So I alluded earlier to the discussions out there about the supposed Lovecraftian influences, and we won't go into it because it's not closely relevant to our focus on dystopia and collapse. But we could talk about the distinctive mark that director Hideaki Anno leaves on this film in ways that somewhat parallel a work that both you and I very much love, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and that would be relevant to dystopia and collapse. Did you have any thoughts about like any kind of parallels or overlaps between, I mean, obviously aside from like angels in Evangelion being giant monsters of sorts?
This did feel like sort of an extended episode of Evangelion without, the teenage angst and the, Freudian psychology as apparent, and without the Avas there. I felt like this was sort of what might have happened. I know there's a whole bunch of lore that takes place before the show, but this felt like sort of what happened before the Avas were created. But it was interesting that Evangelion, the first episode of the very first version of it, also begins with people in Tokyo taking cover as a monster comes in to attack the city. And that's what happened at the beginning of this. It's people taking cover as Godzilla is coming towards them. So there is kind of a parallel between the two.
Yeah, and I dig that idea of the appearance of Godzilla almost as a kind of prequel of Evangelion for the development of the Avas. Another parallel that I felt was there is the critique of institutions of power, and specifically in this case, of course, government bureaucracy and lack of transparency. But at the same time, something I did appreciate about Shin Godzilla is that, yes, there is that obvious criticism towards government, but it doesn't paint a black and white picture either. It shows both the good and the bad, or at least the potential good, if people are willing to work together as randos, task force of misfits, they call them, misfits and outcasts and academic pariahs. The way they come together as a flat organization, free of hierarchy and minimal ego and just kind of cooperating together. It shows the good potential, and I really did like that.
Yeah, that was... You mentioned as well parallels between this and Evangelion, and yeah, I found a lot of potentials because Evangelion does have a lot of scenes of just like literal sort of faceless controlling forces talking with each other and arguing with each other, and the control of information between organizations and governments. And whereas Evangelion sort of uses it almost as an element of horror, this one kind of does it in a comedic way in some ways. Like it's so there's so much bureaucracy that becomes absurd. That part where I think they're asking like, oh, can we fire on the creature? And there's like 8 different people that have to say, can they fire? Can they fire? Can they fire? Can they fire? One of them says it to the person next to her, who then asks the PM, which is hilarious. But yeah, the idea of the ones who are effective or the ones who put aside ego, whereas the ineffective bureaucracy were the people who were saying, well, this isn't our department's purview, so you can't blame us for this. And then the little group of misfits where it's like, there's not going to be any blame or any credit in this whatsoever. Let's just work to figure it out.
Yeah. And this may be a bit of reflecting Anno's own biases, which I must say I, to a significant degree, share. But the other contrast is the ones who are enmeshed in that bureaucracy and just fixated on decorum and rank and all those kinds of things and just are gridlocked because of it. They are noticeably older. You know, like all the remarkable shots of just like men walking through hallways, men in suits walking in hallways, like endless rooms filled with men in meetings. And then the camera sort of like tracks row upon row of older, in this case, Japanese men, contrasted with Rando's task force of noticeably, I won't say like super young necessarily, but noticeably younger than the old guard.
Yeah, that was noticeable as well. And the one woman that was sort of among the bureaucrats, she seemed younger than the rest of the men in the room.
Yeah, Ogashira, one of the scientists in the task force. She was an interesting character.
Oh, no, I mean, there was one woman, shorter hair, looked like she was maybe in her 50s or so, who was among like
the military
PM's
one.
people. Yes, the military.
Oh, yeah, right. There's just so many people in this film. Like I said, it's really dense.
It's crazy how many little, like, the little subtitles that would pop up to describe, like, every little thing. You know, like, this is Task Force Quarters 2, and this is this division of the military. And I was watching it going, do I really need to know?
Yeah, I think it was kind of Anno's point. Like, the degree to which things become so dense and layered and unwieldy and overwhelming when structures become so complex. Like, there's some potential overlap, I think, with the work of Joseph Tainter, who is a major historian of collapse and who's written about this idea of complexity and how even though it's understandable why societies can become so complex, it often comes back to bite them in various ways in certain situations, like disasters being one of them potentially. And even though Tainter himself hasn't really written about this specifically, in this film, one of those ways is, as we've mentioned, the achingly slow pace at which decisions are made in a way that's not proportional to the urgency and scale of the disaster at hand, which could also mean, immediate disasters, right? Like hurricanes or wildfires, but also like larger overarching crises like climate change, for example, or impending economic disaster or whatever.
I found a lot of like COVID related stuff as well. Just, being completely unable to handle the current crisis, or not unable, but unwilling to handle the current crisis because fear of being blamed or fear of public perception turning against you.
Yeah, for sure. So one of our main protagonists, Rando Yaguchi, the young, idealistic politician, again, played by Hiroki Hasegawa, what immediately made me like this character off the bat is that early on, the film makes very clear that he's both a critical thinker, willing to look past the surface of things, even if everyone else around him is saying like, oh, it's just a volcanic eruption. He's like, I don't know. And if it is, it's highly anomalous. And he also obviously is very much a doer, losing patience with the slow pace. And that mentor of his, Akasaka, at one point, is kind of like this interesting bridge between Rando's youthful idealism and energy and the older way of doing things. He, of course, comes to him and says, like, hey, I get it. It's good to be a rebel, but sometimes you have to, like, just toe the line or be practical. And that guy, too, Akasaka, the guy with the glasses, who was Rando's mentor, he's interesting in the sense that at first we're like, is he going to be sort of like a barrier for Rando's efforts? But he genuinely turns out to be someone who really cares and is trying to make the best decisions moment to moment. Like, he starts out being like, hey, you need to calm down, Rando. Just need to like rein it in a bit. But later he's the one pushing for like telling the prime minister, like, maybe Japan really just needs to do what we think is best for ourselves and not bend the knee to the US. You know which guy I'm talking about, right? The guy with the glasses?
Yeah, I know which one you're talking. I agree with your assessment, actually. I think you articulated it very well. Also, by the way, I would like to say I stand corrected on the overwhelming amount of information given. You gave an excellent assessment of that. Yeah, he was an interesting character. I found him as the person who is trying to do the best thing, but is oftentimes shackled by formality.
And going back to the whole thing about every little thing requiring meetings upon more meetings, again, because this film doesn't take any easy positions or adopt simplistic viewpoints. So there's one scene where some of the younger cabinet members are complaining amongst themselves about all the red tape and how each little decision requires a meeting. And then one of them says, well, that's democracy for you. And I thought that was a pretty good point, and I think it's partly true. But it also made me think at the same time, like, okay, in theory, yes. But if democracy is supposed to be government by and for the people, then is it really a democracy if the people want their representatives to do something about a crisis or a disaster, but those representatives are paralyzed by all the things we've talked about? Is that in fact really a democracy, or an effective one at least? But nevertheless, I appreciated how it kept offering counterpoints to its own critique, which, you don't see a lot of. It's easy to take the simplistic view.
No, you're absolutely right about it's interesting because we're also seeing real life parallels, sort of the good thing and the bad thing about bureaucracy, because, the past few years, it was, go too much into current events, as you mentioned at the start. But the last few years, we saw how much red tape can gunk up justice for certain people who should be brought to justice. But now we're seeing how some levels of bureaucracy can actually halt criminal acts when done with authority.
Yeah.
And this film kind of presages a certain level of that.
Yeah, and the interesting debates over interpreting the law. Do you remember that scene where some members of the cabinet are debating something called Article 76 of Japan's self-defense forces law? Like they're saying, can we attack Godzilla, right, with military force? And for me, that sequence wasn't about like unnecessary bureaucracy. It felt like a legitimate debate because it is important to carefully consider what's actually allowed legally.
That was a very interesting scene as well. The idea of like they couldn't use weapons unless weapons were used against them. And of course, contrast to real life things where people are sending folks with weapons to fight against unarmed children. But yeah, it felt like an authentic debate because there are some things that don't use weapons that still need to be protected against. Also, there's the idea that this is a necessary step for them to realize just how ineffective their weapons are.
And it takes them much longer than it should because they just keep thinking, oh, well, we'll just amp it up and that will do it, right? And there was that one wonderful scene in the elevator with some of the older cabinet members, and Rando is in the elevator with them. And they're all like, oh, yeah, this next thing, it's going to do it. And Randall's like, sir, wishful thinking and unfounded optimism by the old Imperial Army is what led to the disaster of World War II and millions of Japanese lives being lost. So please don't make that same mistake. I just love that self-awareness. And as much as it criticizes U.S. policy towards Japan and treatment of Japan, like Anno keeps also essentially critiquing both governments, right? So it's not just like, oh, the U.S. is the bad guy here and whatever. It's like, okay, both governments have failed people in all kinds of ways.
I enjoyed the idea of, like, as you said, relying on basically old solutions to new problems and how that doesn't actually work. You have like a completely unforeseen consequence here. You can't just say like, well, we used to use this method to solve all of our problems. This is a wholly different problem. Again, going to something like climate change. And everybody's like, well, we can just do nothing. We can do nothing. That's what we can do. And it'll just take care of itself. It's like, no, you actually have to try to solve this problem. You can't just ignore it.
Well, it's like in the early stage, Godzilla, in one of his early forms, I can't remember which one, second form or whatever, so many forms. But they're like, oh, it's not going to come on land. It's not going to come on land.
Yeah.
And then it comes on land.
It's when they said like, its own weight will crush it like a beached whale, I guess. But it's like, oh, this is just unknown life form. You can't just assume that it'll like everything else you've ever seen.
Yeah, and that denial, so like earlier we alluded to Don't Look Up. Was there a specific thing for you that kind of reminded you of Don't Look Up?
I can't remember the exact moment, but I do remember just having some shades of like, oh, this is kind of, but I don't remember exact moments, to be honest.
Yeah. So besides the obviously the denial, there was one specific sequence that for me really I felt like, oh my God, this is Don't Look Up. There was the morning after Godzilla's initial rampage through the city, after he's kind of evolved into, I can't remember which number of the form, but he's standing basically, or it's standing, and it's able to use its energy beam. But the morning after, there's this talk show radio of some sort. You hear like this soft jazz music in the background. They're like, good morning, the trains are running. The Tokyo Stock Exchange is open as usual, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, whoa, this feels very much like Don't Look Up.
Yeah, I can see that now. Well, yeah, and they also said, we need to control information to the public. We don't want to panic. And one thing that I thought was really fascinating was there's the scene of, I think they're just two like very minor characters, but they're talking about how they've beefed up defenses in certain neighborhoods. And the guy is talking about the percentage of GDP that those neighborhoods produce.
Yeah.
That was like a dagger inclusion. Just be like, yeah, this is why they're defending these neighborhoods, because they are the rich ones.
Yeah. And then, of course, there is a slightly different side to that in which the legitimate economic concerns of the fallout of a disaster, a major disaster of this scale, where I think it was, there's some journalist guy was talking about like how the economy has basically crashed overnight. There's like massive joblessness, stores and companies are being shuttered. And then Rando's mentor, Akasaka himself, at one point says like, when he's sort of arguing with Rando about going along with when the US decides to drop the bomb, the atomic bomb, and Akasaka wants to go along with it, Rando's like, how can you? And he's like, look, if the stock market keeps crashing at the level that it is and all these things keep happening, our country is basically going to go into default. And that's going to lead to so much suffering as well.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, that they were making an economic argument for destroying the entire city. And I found that interesting.
Yeah, very good point. And then, of course, there is showing that the U.S. asserting itself in. Well, first of all, it's suggested they want to use Godzilla or explore Godzilla as an energy source, I think early on. And here's this thing destroying Tokyo and by extension Japan if they don't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then once it appears that like Japan's own self-defense forces can't take it down by force, well, the U.S. is like, okay, well, we'll just use the ultimate force. That'll do it then. And unilaterally asserting its will, right, upon the country that is the one that's being destroyed in the moment, right? So you're not letting that nation exercise its autonomy and agency to like decide their own fate or make their own decisions. The characters themselves say, ever since the war, we've basically been like a tributary state. Multiple characters, even like the prime minister, the acting prime minister later who replaces the first one. Multiple characters make all kinds of comments about the decades-long unfairness of Japan-U.S. relations. So that was also a major, major aspect of the film and what it was trying to say.
Yeah, and it's also, they say it's like related to the UN, but the UN idea came from the United States. I also found it telling in this film that the U.S. solution to basically every problem in this movie is, well, let's just blow it up. That's the American contribution to every problem in this movie is just, well, let's use a weapon on it. We have guns and we have bombs. Let's use those.
And if those don't work, we got bigger ones.
Yeah, we have bigger bombs. And if that one doesn't work, we'll make a bigger one. But yeah, you're right. It seemed to be that the prevailing idea in the end of the film seemed to be one of Anno sort of saying like Japan should assert its own assert itself instead of serving a role behind other countries in its own domestic affairs.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I think that was one of the most central messages the film was conveying. And then, of course, also, like we were saying earlier, there are massive crises and they're existential and they're real. But even if we can't like completely solve them, we can at the very least mitigate the harm. But the key, of course, is, again, that alternative task force that Rando runs, which also the fact that that task force was allowed to do what it was doing is also a bit of a credit to the prime minister and his cabinet, because they did allow that task force to form. I mean, granted, they waited until Godzilla tore through the city.
Yeah.
But that task force was allowed to form and do its work. And I love all the scenes of all those individual members, each doing their specialty and playing their part of the bigger picture. Each person is doing their thing in it's sort of like a Swiss watch where they're all playing their role and all matters in the big picture. I love that. And Rando's like, there's one scene he's looking around his team. He's like, there's hope for this country yet. I love that.
Well, that was something that I think sort of tied in we talked about sort of the ineffectiveness of the standard hierarchical structure and the effectiveness of the more egalitarian one. And that's something that sort of tied into the UN and US led idea was going to be, you can't say ineffective because, we don't, if it would have worked or not. But the better solution was the one where instead of following along with the US saying, no, we're going to bomb and you don't have a choice about this, it was the solution where they worked with France. And it was a more like equal relationship between the two. And you even have the scene of the French people where one of them is saying, we can't share our data because that's proprietary. We're going to be giving away our secrets. And he's overruled by the one saying like, no, we need to just help people. And that seemed to be sort of the message of the film. It's not just like, stand up and work on your own to solve your own problems. It's work together with other people, put aside your ego, do the things that you do best, just like Rando's task force, and combine that with other people, with other, in this case, countries as well. So the two sort of formed a parallel to me.
Totally, yeah. I too really enjoyed working with other nations and the ambassadors from other nations like France. And I think that one scene that showed the people trying to decide whether to share their data or not, I think that was actually maybe Switzerland?
You're right. It wasn't. Yeah, you're right. It wasn't France. France was the one that introduced that stopped the resolution to.
Yeah, they slowed down. They gave them an extra day before the countdown.
Yes, 24 hours. You're right, though. The actual company outside of Japan was not France. I can't remember exactly which one it was.
I think it was maybe Switzerland. But anyway, it broadens, again, that's global cooperativeness. And there's this great line by Ogashira, the woman who's in Rando's team, where she says, like, guess what? Sharing knowledge works.
Yeah. Gee, what a surprise.
And it's interesting. This might be a good moment, perhaps, to transition because that theme of cooperation and people working together was also very prominent in Godzilla -1, which in some ways is a very different film with a different focus. But that theme of people coming together and cooperating was also, at least in like the third act, a very prominent feature in -1 as well.
Before we completely leave Shin Godzilla behind, I want to just mention one line that I particularly highlighted. I think it was in the sort of the last scene between Patterson and Rando. Forcing one country's sacrifice for self-gain is deplorable. And I wrote that down because it feels quite resonant right now. We're seeing a few cases of it. But yeah, -1 had a lot of collaboration in the end, especially. And again, there was the same sort of idea of how sort of ineffective the military is in -1 when they're talking a lot about the war and the role of the kamikaze pilots and all this type of stuff. And of course, the main character refuses that duty because it's futile at that point. But then you see the people who are willing to, instead of being told by generals, you need to go sacrifice yourselves, they end up volunteering for the mission that is at the end of -1. And they're sort of more effective in that. So again, it's less hierarchical structure and more about like when you do your part because you choose to do your part, you can be more effective.
Exactly. Yeah, there's both a parallel and a contrast in the sense that in Shin Godzilla, there's a hopeful possibility of what government can do when you have people coming together, putting aside differences, working together, cooperating, sharing knowledge. And in -1, essentially the people are abandoned and failed by the government in many ways. And you have the people coming together, civilians. Some of them were former military, sure, but they're now civilians. And they say, and they're essentially not waiting for permission or also, command. So they're not being conscripted. Either they're volunteering, but it's direct action. It's direct civilian action. People coming together, say the government has failed us. We can't wait for them to do anything. We have to do it ourselves. So like taking matters into their own hands. But before we make the complete transition to -1, I also want to share a line. You shared a really good one. And there's also a line that I'll close with my thoughts on Shin Godzilla. So Akasaka, Randall's mentor, at one point at the end, things are Godzilla obviously took its toll. But he says, this country rose up through scrap and build. It'll be done again. So notable not just for the note of hope, but the emphasis on we can't just do the same thing. Like the reason Japan was able to rise up from the ashes of World War II was they scrapped. So he said scrap and build. They scrapped the previous system, which was a military, imperialist, authoritarian regime, obviously. And that transitioned to a parliamentary democracy. So it was truly a radical transformation from what it was before. So he's saying, of course, that there are times when you just can't continue the old same system. You do have to scrap and rebuild. But we did it before, and we'll do it again. And I just really liked that.
Yeah, that was a very good point. Again, going back to the idea of you can't just use the same old solutions to new problems.
100%, yeah. Okay, so I think we're at a good point where we can transition to Godzilla -1. So this one, released in 2023, written and directed by Takashi Yamazaki. A smaller cast, thankfully, easier to keep track of. We have a young soldier named Koichi Shikishima, played by Ryunosuke Kameki. I'm not really sure the pronunciation is correct. Noriko Oishi, played by Minami Hamabe. The mechanic Tachibana, interesting character. And a few characters that I really love. Captain Akitsu, the guy they keep calling Doc. He looks like a doc. And someone they call Kid, played by Yuki Yamada. So that's pretty much the primary cast. And I gotta say, just to start off, this is hands down my favorite Godzilla film of all time. I just love it like so much. Like everything about it, or almost everything about it. There is one small thing that we'll touch on later that I didn't like about it. Like it almost ruined it for me. But I love the other 99% of the film so much that I'm willing to overlook it and just pretend in my own canon, mental canon, that it didn't happen. So we started out, of course, talking about what the monster in Shin Godzilla represented. What was striking for me about -1 is that because it's the newest one, I'm not including the Hollywood stuff, the Legendary Pictures one. With the Hollywood stuff, I pretty much stopped with the 2014 Gareth Edwards version. And then when it started becoming like monsters beating each other up, which I liked as a kid, but not anymore. So I haven't really been watching the Hollywood stuff. But in the ones that I've seen, never before has Godzilla looked and felt so real and lifelike. And yet at the same time, never has it felt so strongly that this is not a movie about a giant lizard monster. It really is. It's the most human Godzilla film I've ever seen.
Interesting. Why do you say it's the most? Because it's about the people more than about the monster?
I just think because I love the characters in this one so much, and I love the relationship between them, and the ultimate themes and messages of the film are so uplifting ultimately and humanistic, that, again, despite the fact that the effects of Godzilla are so impressive, like I feel like it deservedly, I don't really keep track or follow the Oscars, but I know this film won the Oscar for special effects for that year. And yeah,
Sure.
Godzilla in that film looks very vivid and lifelike. But so remember that episode I did on 10 films about the civilian experience of war? Like if I was redoing that list right now, I would almost be tempted to include this one in it. Just because it does such a good job of showing the trauma of war and the lasting effects of trauma, and like how war, for people who are in it, like a couple of characters say in this film, it's not over yet. The war is still going on within themselves. And so that's what I mean. I was so moved by it, like genuinely, that, to me in this film, Godzilla almost feels just incidental. like a little prop.
Yeah, I was going to say you could almost take Godzilla out and put something else of equal threat, obviously, and it would take a lot more rewriting to make it something that isn't a monster. But you could almost take Godzilla out and keep the story basically the same.
Yeah.
So, and you're absolutely right. This is really good.
I'm really glad you liked it. I was excited to get your thoughts on it. But before we jump deeper into it, because I did mention in an almost dismissive way that the more recent Hollywood, like Legendary Pictures films, but I don't, if you have seen the other ones, if you just want to briefly comment on them in any way.
I saw the Gareth Edwards one, which I thought was good. I saw Kong Skull Island. I didn't care for it. And I just sort of tapped out in the franchise. I'm not terribly invested in the Hollywood version of Godzilla and King Kong.
Yeah. I mean, I think Toho Studios really understands the Godzilla mythology the best and knows what to do with the material the best. I think in Hollywood's hands, they're like, oh, yeah, big monsters beating each other up. It just inevitably seems to become that. And so
it's taking the character out of context and trying to put it into something different.
Yeah, for sure. So with Shin Godzilla, we started out talking about, some other things that it represented other than the obvious critique of the Fukushima disaster response. For this one, and again, there comes a point when it does seem to inevitably circle back to the atomic bomb connection. And in fact, I felt like it had one of the most visually striking allusions to the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And also in general, just the firebombing of Japanese cities and civilians in general. Made me actually think about Grave of the Fireflies too.
Yes. That was my first thought. When the opening scenes, when we go back to Tokyo and you see the devastation, and I was getting flashbacks of Grave of the Fireflies as well. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, speaking of PTSD.
Yes.
So for me in this film, despite the eventual circling back to the nuclear devastation, it really just felt like overall a film about war. Just war. And the futility of war, but also like the mistreatment, dehumanization, and devaluing of human lives. The way governments, obviously of adversarial countries, of course, but also nations' own people. Like there's, again, a lot of self-critiquing here of the Japanese government, in addition to the US, but also a lot of critiquing of like this government has placed a very low value on our lives, on Japanese lives, with like, and this is more towards the end of the film, but the Doc character talks about fighter jets without ejection seats, tanks with faulty armor. And these were all actually like actual things that the Japanese military didn't provide their soldiers with. And so quite a bit of this film actually is based on actual history, which is really interesting. I don't want to jump ahead too much. We'll get to it, but there's actually, that plane that Koichi flies at the end in the climactic sequence, that is actually a real plane. They only had 2 prototypes of it, which I read, and one of them did go on test flights. But Japan surrendered shortly after the initial test flight of one of the prototypes, and so it was just shelved and never used. So this film is kind of like it's almost like alternate history, where that plane gets to play this heroic role that didn't happen in real life. But yeah, just like the trauma of war, like we said, the similarities with Grave of the Fireflies, with this city landscape devastated. And it starts out with Koichi, I guess, abandoning, if you will, his ridiculous duty of having to basically kill himself, right? And the mechanics initially, some of the mechanics kind of have that suspicion, but one of them comes up to him and says, I'm with you. Like, what's the point? It's clear we're losing. We're going to lose. What's the point of sending people to die? It's ridiculous. And it reminded me of like, did you see the Netflix version of All Quiet on the Western Front?
No, I haven't. I've heard it's good.
Have you seen any version or by any chance?
No, I haven't seen it. No.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to, the scene towards the end, so I don't want to spoil it for you because it is a good film. I think it's worth watching. But basically there's a very vivid sequence that just highlights the futility of war and the failure of leadership and just placing what, in some situations at least, are just pointless concepts of honor above human lives. And so, yeah, it just reminded me of that. And what are some of your other thoughts?
Well, to go back a couple of points really quick. You mentioned about Doc and the speech that he has about, this country has been treating life very cheaply. That kind of reminded me as well of, I don't know if you remember it, is quite a while ago, Donald Rumsfeld's speech when people were talking about how U.S. soldiers in Iraq didn't have sufficient body armor, or they had to buy their own body armor. And his statement was, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had, something like that. And that particular moment in this film reminded me of the real life parallel, him saying that as well. Or also, there's the movie Enemy at the Gates.
Oh, I haven't seen that one.
I think it takes place in Russia during World War II, but there's a scene where they're like charging, they're battling, I guess, the Nazis, and the soldiers don't have enough guns, so they basically have one unarmed soldier next to the armed soldier, and when the armed soldier gets shot, they're told just pick up the gun and keep going.
Jesus.
Yeah. And that reminded me of sort of the futility of this one, especially in the beginning, like you said, about Koichi, not killing himself for the mission when they say like the war is kind of over. At this point, it would be completely pointless for him to sacrifice himself in a losing effort. And that sort of becomes his entire arc in this movie, is trying to redeem himself for what he sees as an act of cowardice, which would have more likely been an act of pointlessness.
Right.
But we see that as well, because at points he does step up. He mentioned the battle between the small ship and Godzilla, which is an amazing sequence. That is so good. Oh my gosh.
So good, that sequence.
Yeah, it's a chase sequence in water and being chased by Godzilla. It's incredible. But he does, take the action. He has the hands, the nerves for a little while, but then he does eventually take the action and blow up the mine in Godzilla's mouth, which, by the way, great touch of having the rest of the movie, Godzilla has a scar where the mouth healed, which is just a nice detail. But he takes the action, but he still ends up beating himself up, saying he did nothing. No, he did exactly what he was supposed to do.
Yeah.
This was a much bigger force than he could possibly combat individually, which parallels exactly to the idea of one kamikaze pilot was not going to stop an entire bombing campaign.
Right. And of course, if we think about it, if he had followed orders blindly, there would have been no one to deal the finishing blow to Godzilla.
Yeah, that is also true. It was interesting that you mentioned that the plane that they used was also a real plane that was developed, because I remember watching that scene going, well, that's awfully convenient that they just happened to have this plane. I didn't know it was a real thing. So kudos to them for making that connection.
Yeah, I didn't know either, but I was curious, and I looked it up, and indeed it was real. And there's quite a bit of allusions to real history in this film.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, that was placing this in the immediate aftermath of World War II. I'm of two minds of the placement of it. It made it for a very interesting narrative and thematic setting. But at the same time, you mentioned sort of an alternate history where that plane was used. I'm wondering if in this version of history, did it go the same way? Were Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombed in this? Because having Godzilla strike Tokyo immediately after nuclear strikes kind of makes it a little bit murky in my mind.
Yeah.
Because Godzilla is almost equal in destruction. But in a way, it's sort of, I don't know, it felt as though it almost absolved the United States of responsibility, because Godzilla comes in and does the same amount of destruction, but then they don't help with the reconstruction, or possibly, overthrow and put its thumb on the scale, like Shin Godzilla is saying. But one way or another, it just comes in, destroys, and leaves.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's an interesting question. I thought about that too, and I think they deliberately sidestep it for a number of reasons. One is, in a way, if you already include in this semi-fictional universe the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then Godzilla is almost repetition, or not
Yes.
anticlimactic, but like maybe not as big of the shock as is intended in the universe. I think they just deliberately avoid it. And
Yeah. They'd never mention naming those two cities.
yeah, so it might be up to the individual viewer. I don't know. But regarding the US, this film does bring the origin back to US testing of atomic weapons in Bikini Atoll, the series of islands, which in the original 1954 was the origin of Godzilla, right? And this brings that origin essentially back, even though, again, as we've been saying, Godzilla is much more than just that in this film. It's kind of broader, but they include that. And so there is still that the implication and the culpability of the US's use of nuclear weaponry, and also just like the firebombing of the cities, right? That
Yes.
right there, it's not like explicitly mentioned, but it's implied for anyone who's familiar with that portion of history, where it was a deliberate strategy on the part of the US military to target civilian cities, right?
Yeah.
Which is the textbook definition of terrorism, right? The deliberate targeting of civilians to reduce morale, which it did do. That was successful in that respect. But yeah, hundreds of thousands of civilians killed in these bombings. So it's not even just the atomic bombs, which are obviously horrific beyond imagining, but just the regular firebombing of cities like Tokyo and Kobe themselves, as depicted again in Grave of the Fireflies as well. That in itself is horrific. Like Grave of the Fireflies, I at first, before I saw it, thought it was going to be about the nuclear bomb, but it ended up, it was just a regular bombing of Kobe.
Yeah.
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 And so, and just that by itself really is horrific. And when you think about it, kind of dismantles a lot of the narratives of, you know, that Americans like to.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
I know what you mean. The sort
Yeah.
of, heroic or righteousness of the American campaign in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when the minesweeping crew that Koichi's a part of, and I love that whole team, by the way, the banter between them, the camaraderie, the chemistry between those characters. When they get sent to distract Godzilla, essentially, until the Japanese warship can return from its station in Singapore, and they're told to keep it a secret. And the captain, and here again, it's kind of like another parallel with Shin Godzilla. And the captain's like, oh, there it is, the gag order. It's their favorite. This country never changes. And like in a later scene, shortly after that, he's like, yeah, information control is what this country is good at. So it's like that again, that lack of transparency.
That's what they talk about in Shin Godzilla as well. It's something that's, we mentioned it before. That's also something that Anno did in Evangelion, control of information. So yeah, that was an interesting little inclusion there as well. I should have said this at the top. I am not super familiar with Japanese culture and bureaucracy and other such things, not being Japanese myself. But hearing that in 2 consecutive Godzilla movies makes me think that this is something that is prevalent in Japanese government, at least.
Yes. In fact, that reminds me, for anyone who might be interested in some of the real life historical examples of the kinds of things that Shin Godzilla and -1 are criticizing and symbolizing, there's this really powerful book. I read it a long time ago, so I don't remember a whole lot, but it's called Dogs and Demons, Tales from the Dark Side of Japan by Alex Carr. And what I do remember was how compelling it was, and I was sort of glued to it because it was so compelling. And it just really goes into a lot of the absurdities of the way like Japanese government bureaucracy worked, and the contradictions and just like the inefficiencies and the wasting of money just to sort of look like they're doing something, and in so doing like devastating the natural landscape and ecosystems of Japan. It's just a really powerful, obviously dark, but well-researched book that despite having read it that long ago, I can remember enough about it to say that I think I would still recommend it. And so like that would be like I guess a non-fiction version of like Shin Godzilla or something.
There you go.
Oh, you know what was also interesting for me in this film, -1, is that the majority of the characters, the major ones, even if they haven't seen Godzilla with their own eyes yet, even if it's just hearsay from someone else, it's like they don't really have a big problem believing in it. And when they do see it with their own eyes, there isn't this sort of lack of belief or like, no way, this can't be happening. I'm dreaming. It's more like, oh, yeah. Like there was one of the more striking sequences of that for me was when Noriko was on the train, and and she previously heard like Koichi talk about it, and she admirably did not say anything. Like, I don't know what her internal thought process was of whether he was just this traumatized guy like dreaming about something or what. But when she does see it, it's not like, oh my God, it's real. It's just like, oh, she's like, arega gojira. It's like, oh, so is that Godzilla, I guess? And I felt like for me, it was because these characters have been through already like one of the worst possible horrors of war. And so when another horror just gets heaped onto that, they don't really have a problem believing in it, at least,
Yeah.
They might have a problem building up the morale to keep trying to survive, which one of the most striking scenes, again, it's that same sequence that happens shortly after that initial witnessing of Godzilla for Noriko, when she's running away and she trips, and then he's closing in, or not he, sorry, it's closing in, it's about to like step on her. But she just has this look of resignation. And she's a survivor. Like, we see through the early parts of the film, like how determined she is to survive. But then in that moment, she just has this look of resignation on her face. And it's almost like, man, I'm so tired. Like, I just survived the war. And now this, like maybe I just won't get up. Like, that was really, for me, it was just really powerful.
It was a really good point. They've already seen something that should not be possible or something unbelievable. And to have this as well is just sort of, and then beaten down.
Which is why I'm kind of debating whether to bring this up already, but it fits thematically, so I guess I'll just say it. But I alluded to something that almost I just wish they didn't do it. But I love this film so much, and yet the final moment when Koichi is reunited with Noriko, and sure, you could say like, oh, that was a bit of a stretch that she survived after being, in that blast radius.
Yeah.
But I wanted these people to be together so much that I was willing to totally just overlook it. But then they put in that sequel teaser of like the mark, the scar crawling up her neck at the very end. Did you notice that? I didn't actually notice it the first time I saw it. I was like so moved. I was just sitting there and stunned, like, oh my God, I love this movie. And I just totally missed it the first time, which was like a blissful ignorance. I wish I had almost continued to be ignorant. But the second time I saw it, I'm like, what is that? And I'm like, oh no, you guys did not. They just had to put in that sequel. Like
On Noriko's neck?
Yeah, on Noriko's neck, there's a little very anomalous looking scar, or almost like some sort of like, I don't know how best to describe it. It's like some black scar that's clearly not normal, and it's spreading really fast. But it's also kind of a subtle shot. So again, I missed it the first time. But and fans were speculating about that until eventually the director actually confirmed publicly that that is apparently G cells. So cells like Godzilla's cells, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, and the implication, of course, is G cells in like Godzilla folklore or mythology was used to create some of the other monsters. So I'm like, oh God, are you serious? Are you guys going to really take this in that direction? Like, can you not just let these characters, after everything they've been through, war, and then more war, Godzilla, like just let them have a boring, normal life. Like, don't do this sequel nonsense, please. And then, of course, you saw the healing, like Wolverine, right? The little piece of Godzilla chunk in the water that starts healing again.
Yeah, that bothered me as the sequel tease. I was like, oh, of course. I didn't notice the scar at all. In fact, I had a very different reaction to Noriko being there. Seeing that sort of launched me into an idea of like, because Koichi mentions, like, oh, maybe I died, maybe I've been dead for a long time, and this is a hallucination. Once Noriko was alive, I was like, maybe he is dead, and this has been a hallucination, because he ends up accomplishing everything that he would have wanted. He redeems himself. the woman that he clearly loves is alive. He's earned quite a bit of money. He is seen as this hero. He's accomplished everything that he would have wanted. Maybe this is like his own fantasy world.
Yeah, so like the whole film, the whole story essentially being like a post-death dream of sorts.
Yeah.
Have you seen Jacob's Ladder?
N-
Okay, well, I'm not going to say anything, but
okay.
yeah, but there are like a number of movies that kind of play off that. No, never mind.
Of course, no. There's a lot of films that do that, but it's just sort of what I liked about it was the ambiguity of like, oh, is this real or is this the scar though? Kind of gets. I mean, it's the same thing that was interesting to me about the first Joker movie was how much of this is in his head, and then they make a sequel, and it's like, oh, okay, and they would do the same thing if they make a sequel to what would it be called? Godzilla -2?
I don't know. God, I mean, apparently it's already in production, and the two
course.
leads are in it. The actors who play Koichi and Noriko. I don't know.
There were likable characters.
They are.
I did enjoy seeing her be okay because you want them to be together because they were very nice. But at the same time, her death was such a powerful scene, and the way that is visualized, the blast going one direction and whipping the other direction. I've never seen Godzilla's like ray so powerfully depicted in film. It is absolutely terrifying and spectacular.
That was spectacular. And then with that sort of mushroom cloud that comes up after, again, I think that's the most visually direct and compelling image in a Godzilla film that I've seen of essentially the whole, real life origins behind this character. But I liked some of the homages to the 1954. Well, first of all, both Shin Godzilla and -1 pay their homage to the original orchestral theme, the original orchestral score of Godzilla with that march, right? That theme, the Godzilla theme. But then -1 specifically does some specific homages for the 1954 film. Like, I don't know how long it's been since you saw the original one, but there's like a news crew. I rewatched it recently. There's like a news crew on like a radio tower in the old version.
Okay.
And like as Godzilla comes closer, they're like, oh, oh, Mina-san, here it is. Here's Godzilla in front of our eyes. It's coming closer as we speak. Oh, like, sayonara, Mina-san. This is the end.
Yeah.
And the -1 has like this direct allusion to that where there's a news crew on top of a building and they're doing the same thing. They're like, oh my God, it's destroying the city before our eyes. Oh no, here it comes.
Yeah. It clips the side of the building and the whole thing comes tumbling.
Yeah, that was definitely a direct homage, I think, to that sequence in the original. But yeah, no, it's interestingly, I feel like I have less to say about this film maybe than Shin Godzilla, just because that one was so complex and dense. But again, this is, without a doubt, my favorite Godzilla film of all time. I just wish I could remove the whole sequel thing, because
No, I'm completely with you.
yeah. I just wish they would just let it's its own self-contained work, just like it's almost perfect. Just let it be, and let these characters have that life they so deserve. Koichi and Noriko and their adopted daughter Akiko, which, by the way, I am such a sucker for the whole found family thing that in addition to the script just being very well written and the characters being very, well depicted, that component, when it's well done, is like I'm a real sucker for it. It's one of the big reasons why I love The Mandalorian so much, and also like The Last of Us is the found family component. And so I just wish they would let this family and their friends, Doc and the captain and the kid, just give them a regular boring life. Why create this? I don't know what they're going to do in the sequel, but yeah. Anyway, I'll stop. I'm complaining too much about that.
Everything needs to have a sequel. I think didn't Shin Godzilla also have a sequel, or supposed to have a sequel?
I'm not sure, but there was that sort of visual illusion on its tail of the next phase of evolution. Like if they hadn't stopped it when they did, it looked like the tail was gonna sprout a bunch of mini humanoid Godzillas.
Yeah, that's true.
So the next phase, the global takeover, I guess, of the creature, aka global climate
I'm with you though. Like I feel as though this was the better film. At the same time, yeah, there's not as much. It doesn't feel like there's as much to examine with this one as there is with Shin Godzilla. Also, partly because like Shin Godzilla had a lot more sort of contrasting views within itself, which made it interesting to talk about. This one, the sort of themes of it are quite apparent and quite cohesive throughout the entire film. You know, Koichi has a noticeable character arc that talks about his survivor's guilt, his redemption, the ideas of honor, PTSD. They are present throughout the entire film. Whereas Shin Godzilla, different sort of possible meanings sort of seem to come and go throughout and then fold in on themselves and contradict themselves. And this one is much more direct with what it's trying to say.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And of course, that's not to say like which approach is better necessarily, but yeah, Shin Godzilla is sort of like interrogating itself in a way, right? Presenting a point, then a counterpoint, and that just naturally leads to more discussion. But yeah, one thing I did just think of, the interesting thing is the group of civilians that take matters into their own hands, they're called the Civilian Task Force versus the Disaster Response Task Force, also a task force in Shin Godzilla, but that's a government body. And again, this is a group of civilians who feel failed, rightfully so, by the government taking matters into their own hands and not being told to do it, but also not waiting for permission. They're just doing it themselves, again, through cooperation.
Yeah.
And then one other thing that I just like suddenly remembered, because I, in the beginning, was wondering, I wonder why they called it -1. And the answer was simple. Actually, there's a trailer that sort of answered it for me. And I don't know if you happen to see it, but the trailer goes like after the war, Japan was at 0. And then it was like something like this thing appears and it takes it to -1, like even less than 0, right? Like you're already in a state of collapse. Like I've talked about war as its own kind of collapse in previous episodes, and not necessarily permanent, because societies do rebuild and have rebuilt after wars, of course. But for that time, and especially from the civilian perspective, it is absolutely collapse, a state of collapse. If you can't get your basic needs met, you can't get food, you can't get like medical supplies and just basic needs, and those services aren't provided, then obviously that is a state of societal collapse. So that was why they called it -1, is because here's a people that just went through the worst thing and they were at 0, but it's not over yet. Like fate is so cruel that it still has to put them through more, and now they're at -1. So that was interesting. I think that trailer kind of answered that question for me.
It's because, yeah, I was wondering the same thing. I was like, why is it called? Is it because it takes place before the first movie? But like that makes a lot more sense. It's funny answering questions of the film in the trailer. It just seems good.
Yeah, it's like, what if you don't see the trailer?
For people who try not to watch trailers because they want to, go into the movie as blind as possible.
Right. Something I thought would be worth mentioning is that, even the original symbolism of Godzilla remains, if anything, like not just as timely as ever, but even more so, because the doomsday clock, that metaphorical clock that they're called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and they sort of measure, according to their own parameters, the level of existential risk. Although it's not just for, like, a big part of it is the threat of nuclear devastation and warfare, but it's not the only thing. They also add in like other problems like the climate crisis. But basically all of the factors are existential level threats.
Yes.
But earlier this year, they put it at 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it's ever been to the metaphorical midnight. And so here are the world's foremost experts on the matter telling us that we're closer, if anything, to this threat, not less close. We're closer. And I think a vivid recent reminder of that was earlier this year when India and Pakistan had that conflict. They're always in conflict, so maybe that's not the best word. Like crisis might be a better word. So like, Cuban Missile Crisis. So crisis.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of like misinformation, disinformation, maybe some malinformation that was that can present this ever-present threat of escalating the crisis to a point at which it might just, as we were saying in threads, when we were talking about threads in our discussion of 10 films about collapse, you would think theoretically that everyone, in the ranks of power are highly cognizant of the existential threat of making one wrong move. But in the heat of the moment, when emotions are high, and then you have things like misinformation being rampant, and now I read an article about, again, like a group of nuclear experts saying one of the reasons the risk is greater than ever is like now the implications of AI taking on a greater role in warfare. And again, the possibilities of like split second, is misdecisions a word? I don't know, like wrong decisions, or things like deepfakes and misinformation escalating things. So, this character, this mythology is more prevalent than ever. And I just thought it'd be worth pointing that out.
Yeah, the Doomsday Caucus is something that I've been aware of, obviously, for a long time as well. I wonder if it ever gets put back, because we never seem to address the problems that are making it move forward. I wonder if it's ever been moved backwards. There's still just as many nuclear weapons, possibly more than ever before. There's climate change is worse than it's ever been. Yeah, that's a depressing thought.
Let me see here. So according to the University of Chicago blog, the University of Chicago News, it has moved back. I can't see from a quick skim of this article how many times, but it has moved back apparently.
Oh, okay. That's good.
We just need more randos and, and civilian task forces.
Some more Pattersons.
Yeah. But thanks for joining me on this very enjoyable discussion of two excellent Godzilla films. To close today's episode out, I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to close this out with a snippet from that classic Godzilla musical theme by Akira Ifukube. It is still under copyright, but I insist this is going to fall under the fair use clause of journalistic use, cultural criticism. So lawyers, if you're listening to this, go away. You got bigger fish to fry. Leave us alone. So until next time, this is Strange Days, Here We Come, and thanks for joining us.